Alright, Midnight Man's back with another video, and I'm gonna be saying Force Lawn 1,000 times to stop the egg. Alright, let's just get this over with. Force Lawn, 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 Force Lawn. Okay, it's gonna be a long time. Force Lawn, 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 Force Lawn. Oh god, my tongue's getting tired. Screen looks so weird with the pixels. Damn. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Force Lawn, 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 Force Lawn. That's 100 right there. Egg is getting destroyed. Force Lawn, 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 First. I'm saying first now. Force Lawn, 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 Force Lawn. Not click it that time, I don't know. The numbers are kind of so small, so I'm sorry. Force Lawn, 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 none, Force Lawn, 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 fuck. Force Lawn, 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 Force Lawn. I mean, Mr. Beast like did 100,000. I don't know how he did it. I'm struggling at 200 already. Force Lawn, 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 Force Lawn. In case you guys don't know what Force Lawn is a community in the city of Calgary in Canada. Force Lawn, 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 Force. God damn it, it's getting so hard. Force Lawn, 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 Force Lawn. Wait, Force Lawn, 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 Force Lawn. Force Lawn, Force Lawn, Force Lawn, Force Lawn, Force Lawn, Force Lawn, Force Lawn. I'm gonna get a drink of water. Hold on. Force Lawn, 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 300. Force Lawn, 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 Force slon, force lon, 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 force lon. Okay, we're a third of the way there. Force lon, 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 force lon. Was that not clicking? There. Force lon, 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 force lon. I forgot how to say it. Jesus Christ. Force lon, 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 force null, snull, force lon, force null, snot, force lon, 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 force lon. We're at 420. Force lon, force lon, force lon, force lon, force lon, force lon. Force lon, 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 force lon. 440. I'm gonna try to say it like slower, so I'm gonna do it non-stop. My tongue's starting to hurt now. I can't even say force lon now, probably. But you know, oh, I said it once there. That counts. Force lon, 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 force lon. Force lon, 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 worse lon, worse now, force lon, force lon, force lon, force lon, force lon, force lon. Force lon, thought be gone. Force lon, 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 snot, force lon, force not, force lon, force lon, force lon, force lon, force lon. Halfway there. Force lon, 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 force lon. Force lon, 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 force none, fuck, force lon, 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 forels, I give up, I actually give up, forest lawn, forest lawn. Forest lawn, force 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 lawn. Probably not even gonna watch this part, so force lawn, 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 force lawn. If you guys have made it this far, good job for you. Jesus Christ. Alright. Force lawn, force lawn, force lawn, force lawn, force lawn. By the way, I'm not editing the music in because I'm a lazy piece of shit, so it's playing on my speakers there. Right there, as you can see. Force lawn, 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 lawn, force 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 lawn, none. Force lawn, 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 I don't know. Force lawn, 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 forest lawn, forest lawn, force 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 lawn. The thing is, if I keep it outside the box and click here, I have to click in this box here. It shows force lawn, so I have to click it here. So if I move my mouse and I don't click, that's why. Force lawn, 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 damn. Force lawn, 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 force lawn. I'm gonna switch hands. This hand's getting tired of holding the camera. Force lawn, force lawn, force lawn. I'm gonna hold the mouse. Fuck, let me move it properly. I can't find my mouse. There. See, I'm holding my mouse like this now. Force lawn, force lawn, force lawn, force lawn, force lawn. I might need to move it a little bit. There. Force lawn, 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 force lawn. Okay, 2/3 almost. Force lawn, 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 force lawn. Okay. I don't know what that was. Alright, force lawn, 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 force lawn. Force lawn, force lawn, force lawn, force lawn, force lawn, force lawn, force lawn. Force lawn, 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 force lawn. Force lawn, 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 forest 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 lawn. Force lawn, 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 thought be gone, force lawn, thought be gone, force lawn, thought be gone. My tongue. I think I need one other water break. Let's keep going. Fucking just hit this. Force lawn, 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 force lawn. Oh, water made it much better. My tongue was like completely dry. Force lawn, force lawn, force lawn, force lawn, force lawn, force lawn. This can be like ASMR. Force lawn, 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 force lawn. Force lawn, force lawn, force lawn. Leave a like if you want me to do an ASMR. Force lawn, 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 force lawn. Forest lawn, 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 forest lawn. 1, 2, 4, 5. Forest lawn, forest lawn, forest lawn, forest lawn, forest lawn. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Forest lawn, forest lawn, forest lawn, forest lawn, forest lawn. I'll say forest lawn at this point. Forest lawn, 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 forest lawn. Forest lawn, 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 forest lawn. Forest lawn, 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 forest lawn. It's currently 1:47 p.m. still. Forest lawn, 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 forced 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 lawn. I'm saying which shot now. Forced lawn, forced lawn, forced lawn, forced lawn, forced lawn, forced lawn. I'm gonna say a bunch, so you know it's kind of forced lawn, 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 forced lawn. Forced lawn, forced lawn, forced lawn, forced lawn. What? Focus. Forced lawn, 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 forced lawn. 15 more. Forced lawn, 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 forced lawn. Oh, woo! I don't know what that was. Oh, I'm dead. Forced lawn, forced lawn, forced lawn, forced lawn, forced lawn. Just gonna do that. Boom. All right. Why did I do that? That was stupid. See you in the next video, I guess. Alright, peace out.